Okay, good evening,
Okay.
everybody. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about mysterious find from Hampshire, where I am FLO, Portable Antiquity Scheme, that we shall call Oceanus because that is essentially his name. And here is Oceanus and the Trevi Fountain in Rome. This is a Renaissance statue, so it's not actually a Roman one, but this gives you a kind of impression of where we're going with this. And this is the object in question. So this is one of the most interesting finds I've ever dealt with the scheme. I've been a flow for 3 years now, and this thing is quite extraordinary. Essentially, the top line, in a nutshell, it's a finely modelled, high status decorative thing. We're not quite sure what it's from. It has as its principal defining feature this fabulous facing mask of a deity, and it's quite unique. It's quite an extraordinary object. And so I'm going to talk to you about how it's found, the context, the object itself, and ultimately what's happened to it. And it's recorded on a database as SUR77CBD4 with a very long and extremely comprehensive description courtesy of John Pierce. And I think it's possibly one of the longest entries of any artifact on the database. It's quite something. So let's talk about how it's found. It was found by a group of detectorists out on a commercial dig run by a small commercial organisation who are based locally to me. The organiser is very, very good and very clued up on archaeology. And when it was found, he phoned me straight away and sent me images of the find fresh out of the ground. So the find itself was made by one of the detectorists who were on his outing, but he took responsibility to actually ensure that it got reported to myself. Initially, there was a suspicion that it might be from a burial. He had discovered fragments of what he thought were bone associated with this object, and the first suspicion was that there was some sort of furnished inhumation here. Now, to be honest, as FLO, you often put on the spot and making identifications of things, often things you're not particularly familiar with. And my first impression of this object, fresh out of the ground, was that it was a neoclassical object, that it was possibly Georgian, that it was something 18th or 19th century. It was a green man plaque, which is a sort of design you get on a lot of 18th, 19th century objects. So that was, initially I was a bit skeptical about it at first. And I met the gentleman who found it in Woking, and I took it in, and I thought, well, this looks absolutely extraordinary. So this has to be fairly recent. I mean, it's such a finely modelled thing. And it turns out I was completely wrong. And one of the benefits of being an FLO in a nationwide scheme, such as the Portable Antiques schemes, we have access to people like Sally Worrell and John Pierce and all the other experts who can, look at records and say, well, actually, it's one of these. So we circulated the image after I recorded it, and after a few false starts, because a lot of people did actually think it was also a green man plaque, it came back with the opinion that it was actually Roman and genuine and really something quite extraordinary. So I took it in for recording, and this is essentially what it is. What is it? I mean, it's a difficult thing to describe. It's a kind of a composite object because you have this wonderful, finely modelled plaque of the deity on this rectangular strip, 190 millimeters in length, and the strip itself houses a cylindrical housing for an iron bolt on the back. And found with it was a bent bracket, which is the only thing that was associated with the object when it was found that appeared to actually have anything to do with the object. Subsequently, we have determined that the mount probably faced inwards on whatever the frame it was mounted to. But beyond that, at the moment, we are still a bit stumped as to what this thing actually is. Leading theories are it's part of an extremely elaborate piece of furniture, such as a chest, perhaps part of the locking mechanism or the frame. So this is how it's recorded. And if we look closer at it, we can see that there's some very fine decoration on the bar surrounding the mask. It's an ivy leaf and a vine leaf picked out in silver. And it looks like the mask is actually superimposed to some extent over this, which suggests that the mask may have been transferred from something else and put onto this thing, whatever it is. So the big, I think the most interesting about it is who the mask depicts. The mask depicts Oceanus, which is one of the, I suppose, lesser depicted deities in the Roman canon of decorative metalwork. Oceanus was a titan. He wasn't a god. He was a sort of a progenitor of the gods. And in Roman and Greek mythology, Oceanus was a sort of a personification of the force of water, the concept of ocean, the concept of fresh water, not so much a discrete god of the sea like Neptune, but more sort of god, a sort of a whole concept of water made manifest. And as is always in Greek mythology, he was married to his sister, had violent relationships with various gods, and all sorts of excitement. Now, he's depicted quite frequently in Roman motifs and artwork, usually in the form of mosaics. So here's an example of the Oceanus mosaic in the British Museum from Withington in Gloucestershire, where you can see he's depicted with his trident and his sort of crab claw things coming out of his head and the big bushy beard, and surrounded by sea monsters. So that's a sort of very typical depiction of Oceanus. This woodcut is a much more recent interpretation. But there are elements of Oceanus that come through to all these depictions, and one of the most famous in Britain is the Mildenhall treasure, the Century of the Great Dish. There is a face which is a bit like that. It's very much of Oceanus. There's also a depiction on the pediment of the Temple of Sinus Minerva at Bath. So he crops up all over the place, but usually in mosaics. And the other representations that you see are on metalwork. Now these are sort of copper alloy objects which offer some comparisons to the Oceanus object from Hampshire. On the right here, we have something which is essentially a handle from a vessel with these great sort of curling sea monster things curling up and forming a handle. And then we have some other plaques which are decorative objects from various places that are in some of the big museums in Europe, the Romansh Museum in Cologne, and other places like that. So the high status objects in significant collections in Europe. This particular object from Hampshire, these are the parallels. They are really top draw things. And there are a couple of parallels which are much closer in terms of what the actual, how the deity is depicted. Here's one from Lixus in Morocco, and here's a famous one from Bavaria, which is sort of a gargoyle thing. It covers a spout of a fountain. And here we have this sort of the seaweedy face with all the fronds and the tendrils and the various elements which go to define Oceanus, sort of sea monsters and fish and things hiding in his beard. And you can see these elements again in some of the mosaics. So typically Oceanus is depicted as a face with a seaweed moustache, framed by hair, mixed with marine animals and sea monsters emerging from his head. So quite a distinctive thing, which gets later reinterpreted in this idea of the Green Man, which is where I went originally with the interpretation. So in Europe, this idea sort of comes through into the Middle Ages and beyond in this idea of the Green Man, of the face made of leaves. So there's a couple of famous mosaic examples there. Now, having discussed what this thing shows, let's talk about the context, because following the report of the find, our initial interest was to see if it was subject to the Treasure Act and was passed with inhumation. So I got in touch with the county archaeologist and the various authorities of Hampshire, and we needed to investigate the find spot further to determine what was there, because obviously this is a very interesting object. We wanted to ensure that its status under the Treasure Act, and as a single item of non-precious metalwork, it wouldn't have a status under the Treasure Act, but found with it was a single well-worn denarius that was suspected to be contemporary. So obviously, if a second denarius came up, that would be a hoard, and by association with the hoard, it would be a treasure find. So we had to investigate this, and I was very, very fortunate in that the location of the find in northeast Hampshire put it within the sites of Silchester, and specifically Mike Fulford of University of Reading, who's spent much of his career working on Silchester and the Silchester environs. And the find spot fits very much within that context. So I contacted Mike Fulford, and we managed to get some excellent site intervention from the University of Reading, who sent out some geophysics experts and some excavators. And within a couple of weeks of the find being made, we had some excellent field work organised. And a small scale excavation was undertaken with permission of the landowner, and found that the find was deposited beneath a cobbled surface, and it was sealed by a cobbled surface, which itself was sealed by a dark earth layer with 2nd century pottery, provisionally the first half of the 2nd century, which gives it an excellent date horizon. Now, associated with this find was this coin, which I've already mentioned, which was found with the detectorists, and also a placed bovid skull, a cattle skull, upside down in a pit beneath the surface. So it's theoretically, deposited at the same time. No other elements of this item of furniture were found by the excavators on the site survey, which suggests it was deposited in isolation and deliberately sealed. Now, we don't know if the floor was inside or outside a building, but it's clearly an intentional deposition in isolation. And if we look at the wider contextual framework of the site, the little yellow star here is approximately where it's found, in the outskirts of what is now Basingstoke, not far from Calais Atrabatum, this third biggest town in Roman Britain at the period we're talking about here, which is the late 1st century, early 2nd century AD. This is my patch for the pass between Winchester and London, so this is an area I know very well. And in terms of Roman archaeology of the area, it's quite a rural hinterland. We have villa sites, places like Odium and Crondall, but the nearest big town is probably going to be the Venta Belgorum, Winchester, or Pontus, which is Staines. There are a couple of other interesting things to mention. We're down the road here from the Alice Holt pottery industry near Farnham, and also the Roman temple site of Warnborough in Surrey, which the looting of which in the 80s was one of the stimulus for the entire Portland Antiquity scheme and the Treasure Act. So very, important to mention. So there's a lot going on in the area, although it may not appear to be a particularly well-developed area in the Roman period. It's quite a rich rural hinterland with some significant things going on. So it looks very much like it was part of that environment. And so a little bit of site survey and fieldwork revealed that a few field just adjacent to the find spot had CBM and pottery, which suggested a late 1st century villa complex. It was very much the same sort of materials produced by the Neronian tile kilns at Little London, and the pottery of similar dates. So it suggested that whatever surface this was buried under was part of a villa or a mill complex in the valley of the river in the area. So there's a lot going on, a lot of potential for future work and future investigation, but a very high status object to be buried in a spot like that, which suggests that whoever owned the villa site was quite important, because the chances are this thing was made abroad and imported. It's a really prestigious object. Now, the outcome of the object is actually quite a happy one for the PAS, because it's in the British Museum. It's been acquired, and it's currently undergoing conservation analysis and is in charge of Richard Hobbs, the BM. And so it hopefully will end up on display, which is fabulous. And the only reason that's happened was because of a bit of a legal loophole under the British common law. All finds made in a piece of land are actually the property of the landowner. This is something that's not widely appreciated in the metal detecting community, but it is true. So the landowner in this case was a very well-established charitable trust in the area who own lots of land and they run farms and things, and they had a very keen interest in the object when it came out. And there were basically the detectorists on the land had permission, obviously, to be there. It was all above board, but they didn't really have any solid written contract enabling transfer of title of finds, which is a very, very important legal subtlety that nobody ever seems to remember in metal detecting, in that just because you found something, it doesn't belong to you unless you got it in writing. And because of the perceived value of the object, because the detectorists who found it was immediately being pursued by collectors, he was offered a lot of money on Facebook and social media very quickly once he posted the pictures. The landowner retained the find because he didn't want this high value item being lost, largely because as a representative of a charitable trust, the landowner or the farmer in question did not feel able to give that much away. And that's fortunate for us because it enabled the British Museum to step in and the trustees, the charities, to arrange a sale and acquisition to the British Museum. So from our perspective, that's a happy ending. It's also worth mentioning that the organizer of the outing himself was very interested in archaeology. He was fully involved in the entire process. He joined in the dig. He was very enthusiastic. I hope he learned a lot, and he seemed to have really got a lot out of it as a positive experience. So I am seriously hoping that the entire experience was a positive one for everybody. And thank you for your time. And thanks go to John Pierce, Sally Worrell, Mike Fulf, and Richard Hobbs for their invaluable assistance in this work.